Tony Park, thank you so much for coming on Northern Vibe, mate. I'm really happy to have you here.
Well, Matt, it's great, and thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
No. A chap that actually gets paid to pursue his passion. It's no small thing. And you are one of the rare people that actually makes a living from scribbling. Tony,
Yeah.
ask the hardest, biggest question straight away. How do you do it?
Yeah, well, look, it's a bit of a numbers game. But when I was first published, my first book came out back in 2004, and I remember my publisher is a lovely lady. She's a good friend of mine today, but she can be quite a let me say, a fiercely respected person in the industry, you know, who tells it like it is. And she sat me down and gave me the New Author Talk 101, which was don't expect to make any money out of it. So first of all, you should be very grateful that we've published you, because there are thousands of people that write manuscripts every day, and and the odds, unfortunately, because only so many books can be published, a lot of people don't make it to a commercial publisher. So I was told, number one, consider yourself very grateful and lucky that we've published you, which I was. But then she said, don't expect to make a living out of it, because it's a fact that depending on who you talk to, it's either 1 or 10% of Australian authors actually make enough money from their writing to live off. And I would say that could probably apply around the world, unless you write the breakout #1 bestseller of that month or year. Nobody, not even publishers, they don't even know what that book's going to be. But if you write the breakout book that sells a couple of million copies, that can be a good way to make a living. But I have to say, I that's not me. But I also, it's funny, I almost feel sorry for people like that, because if you write a book that your first book sells millions of copies, you're under huge pressure to deliver something of equal or better standing. And then you get people like me who write a lot of books, basically. So my 20th novel's come out, and my 10th biography has just come out. So I've written 30 books over the last 20 years. And eventually what happens, I couldn't start living off my books when I wrote my first novel, like most people, you know, sold X number of copies, but it's not enough to live on. I still had a day job. I had a day job for about another 7 or 8 years. And it was when I started to branch out, and I started writing some non-fiction as well as a novel a year, because I write a novel a year set in Africa. But when I started doing some non-fiction, that gave me a bit more income. And by that stage, I had 7 or 8 novels still in print. And so the royalties from those is a slow burn, but it goes on and on. And now you'll find a lot of authors, whether they're commercially published or, as we say these days, independently published, because there are very many other ways, many other avenues to publication. The ones that make enough to live off it, they've either written the #1 bestseller that sold 5 million copies, or like me, they've written a lot of books.
Well, see, that's it. And we're going to jump a fair bit ahead now when it comes to that. You are a very prolific writer, and a book a year is no small feat. So how do you discipline yourself to do that?
Yeah, well, look, Matt, I always say it beats working. You know, I could be doing a proper job. I could be out there building houses in the sun, or digging ditches, or firing a gun in the army like I used to be, or driving a bus, or being a dentist or a plumber or a doctor, none of which I could do. So this is about the only thing in life that I was ever, I think, any good at when I was a kid, writing. I don't say that as a boastful thing. I'll say there was nothing else. I was useless with my hands. I couldn't do maths at school. I couldn't do science. It was embarrassing. As I got older in school, I realized how limited I was in some subjects. But I always wanted to write a book. So I had a passion, I had a desire to write a book. And I was lucky, because, like I said, I couldn't do much else. You know, I was pretty useless at everything else. But I love it, and I think that's a key for something like writing, because I don't want to make too light of it. It's not easy. I dare say it's not easy for anyone to follow their dream, whether their dream is to be a first-grade footy player, or international tennis player, or a brain surgeon, or something like that. It takes work, and it takes time, and persistence in some cases. And so it is my job. I do a living off it. And if you talk to my wife, who's the CFO of our little 2-person company, I have to meet my targets. I've got to make a certain amount of money. And the way I do that is by writing at least 1 book every year. So I write a novel every year. And some people say that's prolific, but I say, Matt, what else am I going to do with my time? You know, I love it. And in one sense, I'm getting paid to do my hobby. So I do consider myself very grateful. But yes, it's work. You know, I've got to get up in the morning. I work Monday to Friday. I have a quota that I have to write every day. And then often, as I have done in the last several years, I will do another book. I'll do a non-fiction biography where I typically team up with someone and I write their story with them, like a co-written biography. It's sometimes called ghostwriting, but we're open about the fact that I'm helping the person. And by doing 2 books a year, I can make enough money to live on. So I'm prolific, but I have to be, and it's the path I've chosen in my life. And like any other job, some days it's great fun, and sometimes it can be a bit stressful. And I've been I'm writing a book now, my 22nd novel, which will come out next year, hopefully. I'm editing my 21st novel, which comes out in August, and I've been working with the guy on a proposal for a non-fiction book to write later this year. And I'm dealing with a lovely lady, one of my readers, who's a Swiss-German lady by the name of Maya, who's currently in South Africa, traveling around South Africa. And she's translating my books into German. So I'm also running a business. I'm looking at releasing 3 translated books into the German market. This is what I'm doing every day. So yeah, it's a job, but I love it. And these days, increasingly, when you're an author, you can't really say, oh, I'm going to lock myself away in my writer's garret and, get inspiration and, hopefully the ideas will flow. No, it's a job. I've got to work hard. I've got to deal with translations. I've got to deal with edits. I've got to deal with marketing, work with my publishers. But yeah, I love it. And if that's prolific, then that's what it entails. A lot of work, basically. But I'd be lying to you if I said it wasn't a great job.
And mate, look, I get that idea, but discipline is the foundational, I suppose, characteristic that all other characteristics come from.
Yeah,
you kind of made light about the inspiration thing, and that's fair enough. But to write well, you do have to channel something. Like you're channeling something. You know what I mean? Like just the fact that you're a prolific writer, but you're a prolific good writer. Like if you're writing complete crap, like no one would be reading it, and no one would be translating it in a German, so what do you do? Like, how do you kind of like pitch into that? Like, it's like, okay, you wake up in the morning, it's kind of like paramilitary. It's like, all right, inspiration 2, 3, mark.
Yeah, well,
how it works, or like you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning with the
Yeah, thanks for your comments. I appreciate it and the feedback. But yeah, it's a very good question, and I've got to think about it, because for me, it's a process, and it's a natural process. It's a very good question. Now, if I think about that, I know a couple of things that do work for me. This is a funny job where you've got to be disciplined. I have to write a certain amount of words every day, every weekday, otherwise the book is not going to write itself. But you're right, the inspiration has to come from somewhere. One thing I've learned in my process is work hard, but don't try too hard. And I don't ever second guess myself. So this could be a long answer, but the way I write is I don't have a plot. A lot of authors, and the conventional wisdom for many people in writing, is that you have to have it all mapped out before you start. You have to know the beginning, the middle, and the end. You have to know who all the characters are. You know what they're going to do and everything that's going to happen and how it's end before you start writing. I learned very early on I can't do that. I'm just not capable of doing that. So my process is that I start with an idea, and I don't know who the characters are or where the story's going to go or who the baddie is or anything. And so I just make it up as I go along. Now, for me to get inspiration, I can't try too hard. I can't be thinking days or weeks ahead, because I know if I do, I tend to get tied up in knots, and I tend to sort of start doubting myself, and it's better for me to sit back and listen. This job is like paid daydreaming in many respects, and part of the process is to empty your head. So when I'm in Australia, like now, I'll go for a run or I'll go for a swim, and I'm not necessarily thinking about what's going to happen next, but I'm freeing my mind of all the other stuff, the deadlines and the business side of the job and anything else that's happening in my private life or anything like that. I'm just giving some time by myself just to think. When I'm in Africa, because my wife Nicola and I have another house in Africa in the bush, what we tend to do is we'll go for a drive in the bush in the Kruger National Park, which is next to where we live, looking at animals. Now, often that drive will serve another purpose because we live on a wildlife estate, a game reserve, and we're about 35 kilometres from the nearest supermarket. And to get to the shops, we have to drive through this magnificent African National Park, the Kruger National Park, where we're seeing lions and elephants and rhinos and things eating each other and chasing each other and stuff. And that, of course, comes into my books because they're all thrillers set in the African bush. So I am, if you like, I'm getting a bit of research for free and a bit of inspiration. But I think importantly, I'm emptying my head. And I dare say a lot of people who are interested in writing, and this was certainly me early on when I was working full time, one of the challenges is time and space, having enough time, not just time to write, but having the ability to step away from everything, go for a run, go for a swim, go for a drive in the African bush. But that can be hard, right? When you're working full time or you're raising kids, or, you know, you've got debts and you've got pressures in your life or social commitments and things. So I think that's an important part of the process. And I think for me, it's a really good question, Matt. I think if I think about it, it's probably the zero time. It's the downtime that just allows me to open the mind and not even try too hard, just to sort of have a little bit of blank space, and hopefully the characters will start talking to me, as they sometimes do.
Yeah, I mean, I got to be honest, that actually makes total sense to me too. This is beautiful. I think this is a beautiful Old Testament line. It just says, "Be still and know that I am God." And that's the kind of thing where you just
love it.
Shut up. Just shut up, dude. Just sit there and be in the moment. It's kind of zen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, good way of putting it.
I really want to discuss your latest books. You know, they're very exciting, and I know you've got some stuff coming up. I'd love to get a scoop on that. But I'd love you to tell us about the first book you published, Far Horizon, because I know there's a really interesting backstory to the hows and the whys and where you were when you got the news and all that kind of stuff. I think 2002, I believe it was.
Yeah.
It was a pretty big year.
A very big year for me.
Magnificus for Tony Park. Can you tell us?
Yeah, so I left work, full-time work, with the aim of writing a book, with the support of my wife. She agreed to give me like 6 months to try and write a book back in '96. And I failed. I wrote a book exactly how I mentioned before. I read a couple of textbooks about how to write a book, and I had it all plotted out meticulously, but it was really difficult. I found this incredibly challenging, very, very difficult process to think up a whole story before I started writing it. But I did, and I wrote a book set in Australia, set in the Northern Territory during the Second World War, and it was rubbish because I had no affinity with the landscape. I'd never really been there, and I was writing a book that I thought other people would want to read, like overseas people. They want to read a book set in the outback, right? So I'll write something set in the Northern Territory. But I didn't really know. It was an exercise to go through. I didn't think of it as an exercise. I pinned my whole future hopes on it, but it didn't work for me. And this whole business of knowing how the book was going to end before I started made it quite boring. So when I was writing that book, I knew what was going to happen. It was like there were no surprises. There was no creativity. We talk about creativity. Creativity for me is not knowing where the inspiration is going to come from, what's going to happen. But so I went back to working for a PR company. And then my wife and I had started traveling to Africa in 1995. We went on a holiday, on a once in a lifetime safari holiday, but we got hooked. It happens to people, you know, we want to keep going back. We traveled back in 96, we traveled back in 97. 1998, my wife took redundancy from her work and got a bit of cash. And we set off back to Africa on our first big trip. We went for 4 months, and we up until then we'd been hiring vehicles. Southern Africa is a great self-drive destination. In case any of your viewers or listeners are interested, it's a really easy part of the world to travel around. You mightn't think it, but it is. And so we had rented cars, and in '98 we bought a vehicle. And we set off on a 4-month tour around Africa. We're just ourselves. But at the time, and even now, you would see a lot of tour vehicles on the road. And what a very popular form of travel is the overland tour. Used to be mostly younger backpackers, but today it's people of all ages, travelers that sort of come together in a group. but they share the chores and the work, and it's a participative sort of holiday. And I thought, I'll write a book set on a tour going around Africa. So I had another crack and I started writing a book, but that was the extent of the planning and preparation I did. I'll write a book set on a tour, and away I go. I just started writing. I was in the Kruger Park at the start of this 4-month trip. I was watching a bunch of backpackers put their tents up. They were on one of these overland tours. It was hilarious. Nothing funnier than watching someone try to put up a tent for the first time.
Yeah, that's right.
And so I write this book, and I'm making it all up as I go along. And I enjoyed it because I didn't know what was going to happen next. Each day we would pack up our old secondhand Land Rover that we bought, and our secondhand tent that we bought, and we'd move to another camp. And my story would move with me. The tour, the fictitious tourists on the fictitious overland tour would move to whatever spectacular location that Nicola and I were going to the next day. And at the end of that process, I had finished a book. But importantly, I really enjoyed it, unlike the first book. So I sent this book off to a publisher. A friend of my mum had a friend whose daughter worked in publishing. This is not a good thing to do, because I got in touch with her, but the last thing that anybody who works in a publishing company wants to hear is my mum.
Yeah.
That's a kiss of death, mate. That is a kiss of death. But what happened was she mentioned Africa, and as it happened, my publishers, Pam Macmillan, and this lady worked for Pam Macmillan, just happened to be looking for a mass market fiction thriller set in Africa. So on that basis, they read it, and that was like back 1999 or so. And then they did a really unusual thing. They came back to me and said, "What, we kind of like this, but you got to do some more work." And I said, "Oh, like, I will do whatever you want to. You tell me." "Yes, sir." Like, I mean, yeah, you tell me to jump, I'll say how high. And so it was an unusual deal where the process was reversed. Instead of getting a deal and then getting an editorial report, I got an editorial report. And this publisher said to me, "Look, here's the deal. If you go away and do everything I tell you," it's the same woman, "if you go away and do everything I tell you, I'll have another look." And so I did. And I spent about another year trying to fix that book up. And I sent it off to Pam Macmillan. And in the meantime, I've been in the Australian Army Reserve since I was 17, since 1982. Never did anything or went anywhere. I was a typical sort of Army Reserve soldier, spent all my exercises in Holsworthy in Sydney and Shoalwater Bay in Queensland, all these sort of wonderful places. And I got a call one day saying, "Would you like to volunteer to go to Afghanistan?"
You were voluntold.
All very civilized.
You were voluntold.
Yeah, I was. And I was by this stage, I was a public relations officer by virtue of my civvy job, where I've worked in journalism and PR. I was a digger originally, and I was an infantryman and air dispatcher. And then eventually I went to Army PR as a kind of shake and bake officer. They made me an officer. And the boss, this colonel, called me up and said, "How would you like to volunteer to go to Afghanistan?" And I'm like, "Oh, well, I was going to go to Africa, but I thought, oh, okay, I'll go to Afghanistan." So off I went to Afghanistan as a PR officer in July 2002, having sent this book back, Matt. But as you can imagine, my mind was suddenly filled with a lot of other stuff.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I had to get ready to go away, and it was a typical Army bureaucratic nightmare to get all the, jabs and approvals and all the boxes ticked before I went. And I'd kind of forgotten about the book. And although when I went off to Afghanistan, I did think, well, I hope something happens. And while I was over there, I got an email because I had access to my civvy emails, and it was from this publisher. And she said, "Open this email, it's good news." And I was actually in Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan, not far from Kabul. And I get this email saying, "We're going to publish you." And I got on the phone because we had a great communication system. And I called her up and she says, "Oh, congratulations, we're going to publish you." I said, "Oh, that's great. I'm in Afghanistan." She said, "What are you doing there?" And so we were dry. We were off the drink. I couldn't even celebrate or anything, but it was an amazing experience. And I got the news over there. And it still took a couple of years for there was a publishing process that had to go through. And the book actually eventually came out in 2004. It was delayed a bit. And so that was the year I turned 40. And I think it is not an overstatement to say that my life really began again at the age of 40. And I've written a book, at least one book a year ever since, sometimes two.
Well, mate, and good on you for doing that. But there's really different styles of writing to the fiction that you're talking about before, and the fact writing, which again, ghost writing is really the wrong way to put it. Co-author, I think.
I'm comfortable with the term. I think it has the stigma attached to it or anything, but yeah.
I dead set reckon co-authoring is perhaps a more accurate. But so what do you find? What do you find hardest? What do you like the best, and what are the differences?
Yeah, really good question. Yeah, I think in my mind, when I thought, I want to write a book, when I was a little kid, it's all I ever wanted to do since I was a little kid. I wanted to write novels. I want to write fiction, and that's fun because you're making all this stuff up. You're transporting yourself and hopefully the reader to another place, a different continent, a make-believe world, and it's fun, and that's great. But I have to be careful. I don't want to downplay it. For me, it's the only thing I ever want to do. It's my passion, but it does take a bit of effort. There's like 120,000 words in one of these suckers, and bear in mind, you're having to make it all up out of thin air. So it is pretty intense. And for me, it's a pretty intense 6 months of sometimes hard, but rewarding work. And I think, like I was saying earlier, if you asked me that question about how do you make money out of it? Well, one book a year, even one book a year, it's hard to make money out of, but 2 books a year is better. But it would be hard to write 2 novels a year, I think, because my books tend to be pretty big. I've got other friends who write in different genres, and they write smaller books, like about 60,000 words. And 2 of those is like writing one of these, so that's okay. They can do 2 books. But what I found with the nonfiction, when I was, I kind of was sounded out to ask if I would work with someone to write their book. And I never really thought about writing nonfiction. But what I did find was I had worked as a journalist for a number of years when I was younger, which I really enjoyed. I wasn't very good at it. I don't think I was a very good reporter. I wasn't like a foot in the door man. I was not an investigative journalist, But I liked writing stuff. And I found that when I started writing nonfiction, the skills that I learned as a journalist, interviewing people, getting them to talk about their feelings and their innermost, personal sort of traumas and triumphs and tragedies that they've been through in their lives. You kind of do that on a day-to-day basis as a journo, and you have to put people at ease, and you have to be able to hopefully correctly capture what they're saying. This is very much like writing a nonfiction book, and so I found it was a good day job. So if the novels are like my passion that I love doing, I can quite comfortably do a novel and a co-written biography every year. And the biography to me becomes like my day job. It's like a really cool day job because you get to meet really interesting people, sometimes very well known people who've done extraordinary things, and you get to know them and write their story. So I would say easy or difficult is kind of maybe too simple, but for me to write a biography is not that difficult because I'm not having to spend that Zen alone time trying to make stuff up, because it's there. The story is in front of me. It's the person's life, ABC. We know how it's going to end. So it's just a matter of capturing that. So I really enjoy it. I really enjoy the nonfiction because it's like a really good income and a really good day job, and you get to meet fascinating people. So it's kind of, for me, it's really capturing the best of what I liked about being a journo. I like meeting good people, nice people, and learning about them and what makes them tick and writing their story. And that's what these biographies are. So yeah, and I've met some incredible people. I had a good run of Queenslanders, mate. I worked with Daniel Kieran, VC. Yep. Who was a recipient of Victoria Cross from Afghanistan.
He's from near Bundy.
Yeah, exactly. His mum lives in Bundaberg, yeah. And he's a truly inspirational, fantastic young guy. Well, he's younger than me. Daniel Kieran, and his book was called Courage Under Fire. And then I also was very privileged to be asked to work with Keith Payne, VC, who's the last of our surviving Victoria Cross recipients, from Vietnam, and Keith's from Rockhampton. and sorry, Mackay. And so I work with Keith on his book, which is called No One Left Behind. So that's amazing for me, a guy that used to be like this Army Reserve soldier. I get to meet the guys, two of the living recipients of our nation's highest award for valor, and I get to write their story. Like, how cool is that? And as a bonus, they're fantastic blokes, like absolute national treasures, the pair of them.
Yeah, and you end up dead set mates with them and drinking beers with them and stuff
Exactly. Keith Payne was buddy twirling my wife around the dance floor at his anniversary party. So
he can cut a rug, can he?
He can cut a rug. Oh, Keith, I'll tell you, he's still going strong.
And then there was War Dogs as well.
Yeah, and that's the other interesting one, because some of the biographies I've done are with people who have made their mark on history in many cases, and are quite well known people. Yet the other half of them, or several of them that I've written, are ordinary people, but they have done extraordinary things. And by ordinary, I mean they're not in the public eye. They are extraordinary people. So through a mate of mine, an ex-army mate of mine, John Roberts, who's an engineer, he was working in Afghanistan as a contractor after I'd come home. And he said, there's a bloke you want to talk to. And he's a bloke by the name of Shane Bryant, who's become a very good mate of mine. And Shane was a former Australian Army and New South Wales Police dog handler who had got a gig as a contract explosive detection dog handler in Afghanistan, working for the US Special Forces. In the early part of the war, in the early 2000s, the Americans did not have enough dogs. This happens throughout the history of man and animal and warfare, is that during wars and wartime, this goes to First World War, Second World War, Vietnam, they all of a sudden realized we need dogs for their phenomenal tracking and sniffing ability to detect bombs and booby traps. And then when the war's over, they're put out to pasture. And tragically in Vietnam, they were left there. They were abandoned, the dogs, for quarantine reasons. So the Yanks found themselves the Americans found themselves with not enough dogs. Excuse me to my American friends. But and so people like Shane, civilians, were brought in and put in as military contractors to work as dogs. And Shane is a great guy, a lovely guy with 5 kids, been married a couple of times, and he was like a single dad. And then he finds himself as like a FIFO, like a fly-in, fly-out soldier, working for a couple of months at a time in Afghanistan, going home to see the kids for a few weeks, going back to Afghanistan for about 10 years. And so I wrote his story with him called War Dogs, which is an amazing story in its own right. Just a fantastic guy, not a public figure, but with an incredible story, like an absolutely incredible story. And we re-released that book, an updated version, a couple of years ago. And I've just done another one in South Africa with my South African publishers. This is the Australian edition.
This is what I want to talk about.
Well, you ask away, mate. Don't let me stop talking. You ask.
No. I want to talk about that.
Yeah, good.
Tell me about it, bro.
Yeah, well, Rhino War is
Flash it up again.
Of Major General Johan Jooste, who is a retired South African Defence Force general. Now, the interesting thing about General Jooste was, he's had a very interesting career. He joined the army back in the early 70s and served through what was known as the Border War, where the former South African regime under the old apartheid days was involved in a protracted conflict in Namibia, which is now known as Southwest Africa, and in Angola. It was very much a Cold War where their opponents, their nationalist opponents who were fighting for independence in their countries, were backed by Soviet Russia and Cuba. And the South African Defence Force was covertly backed, and their allies were covertly backed by the CIA, in fact. So it was a kind of a Cold War kind of conflict that was pretty much out of the public eye up in Angola in the bush. But in 2012, retired General Johan Jooste found himself recruited to fight a new type of war, and that was to help protect South Africa's population of endangered rhinoceros, white rhino and black rhino in the Kruger National Park, which was coming under relentless attack due to a renewed interest in rhino poaching. That is, rhinos being killed for their horns, which are marketed in parts of Southeast Asia and China as traditional medicine, or even more, perhaps more sinisterly, just as a status symbol. It's a rhino horn is a commodity that's seen as a must-have thing for wealthy people. And what was happening was they were losing so many rhinos at that time. In the Kruger National Park near where I live, they were losing about 3 rhinos a day, so 1,000 animals per year. And a raid against numerous poaching gangs crossing from neighbouring Mozambique, the country next door, heavily armed gangs armed with hunting rifles and AK-47s, was the core of about 400 National Parks Rangers. And when you think of National Parks Rangers in Australia, these are the same sort of people in South Africa. So you know, typically your ranger in Australia, they might they've probably got a love of wildlife and nature and conservation. They might be Indigenous people, First Nations people, have an affinity with the land, lots of parallels. Well, all of a sudden, these guys and girls are no longer out there protecting animals. They're in a war zone, and they're up against a heavily armed and wily opponent, and generally used to, quite controversially, let's just call it for what it is, as a retired white general who had served during the apartheid era against the forces of liberation, Nelson Mandela's ANC and co. He's recruited by the African National Congress government, quite controversially, to paramilitarize the Ranger Corps in the Kruger National Park, to give them the skills, the equipment and the training to take this fight to the poachers. And over a period of a couple of years, he does that through not just improved training and weaponry, and he mounts a very successful international fundraising campaign, which ends in them doubling the size of the park's air wing. He gets an extra couple of helicopters. He gets more fixed wing aircraft so that they can have a coordinated military style rapid response to poaching attacks. But he and his wife, Arena, have a very close eye on the morale and the well-being of the rangers, so that they know to have, as you probably appreciate, to have an effective fighting man or woman, you need to care for their mental health, their morale, their families. And so a lot of these rangers, you know, were living in substandard accommodation. Their rations weren't getting through to them. Their kids were stuck in remote ranger posts with their spouses with nothing to do, no TV, no phone signal, no playground equipment. So as well as working on sharpening the teeth and the front end of the fight against poaching, Johan Juste and his wife put a lot of work into the other end of the fight, that is improving conditions for rangers and their families and looking after their morale. And what happened, without spoiling the entire story, well, I'll let people buy it and find out what happens. But
yeah, you want to know the rest? Buy the book.
It's still an ongoing fight, and it's by no means won, but he was able to achieve some quite remarkable things in his time heading up the Rhino War, which is the name of...
Well, it kind of makes sense, because a lot of those blokes would have been former SWAPO soldiers. Like, it would have been the same kind of people, like, you know. So
on the other side, yeah, the poachers certainly... Mozambique was a country that had endured decades of civil war, and they were going through their own conflict as they transitioned from being a Portuguese colony and then fighting a protracted civil war that was backed by the left and the right. Again, it was another Cold War conflict. And so you have hardened men over there who are excellent bushmen. There's a lot of grudging respect in this book for the poachers. Excellent bushmen who go out there with not much at all, you know, a pair of sandals, sometimes a pair of sandals shaped or camouflaged to look like animals' hooves. You know, they would stick animals' hooves on the bottom of their old truck tire Ho Chi Minh sandals, you know, out in the bush with an AK or a hunting rifle, living off the land, and expert trackers with skills honed during decades of war as well. And here we have our National Parks Rangers, like I said, quite often conservationists who join with an eye for protecting the bush and wildlife, having to go man on man or woman on man and tracking these people through the bush. One of the most fascinating things for me, Matt, in this book was, you know, in the Australian Defence Force and many other Western Defence Forces like the UK and US, we have been endlessly debating for decades the role of women in combat. in the South African National Park Service, which has a high proportion of female rangers, these ladies were going into battle, and they were subject to the full range of trauma of having seen rhino slaughtered, having been in gunfights, having shot people, having seen people shot, seen people died, having to administer to wounded rangers by virtue of their training. And that was not only took in tracking and marksmanship, but also first aid training and coordination. We have a situation today where we're now 11 years on since Johan Neuster moved in to begin the process of paramilitarizing that force. To date, only 2 rangers, as far as I'm aware, have been killed, have sadly passed away as a result of enemy action, of being shot by poachers. So he created a force that was not only incredibly well trained and well disciplined, but very, very effective as well. And the role of female rangers, I do talk about quite a bit in Rhino War. There's one, if you'll permit me, there's one really moving scene in there where, as I said, the general has an eye to the whole package when it comes to a ranger, including their mental health. So they have a psychologist on call in the Kruger National Park, and this psychologist, she works with the rangers, and she comes to the general one day and says there's these 2 female rangers at a remote ranger post, and she's got serious concerns for them. She says they've seen too much, they've been involved in too many contacts, too many gunfights, seen too much trauma. He says you've got to take them out of the fight, you've got to give these 2 ladies a rest. So he goes and sees these 2 women and sits them down. He's like, thank you for your service, we know what you've been through, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to give you a break. And they turn around to him and they say, no, General, we're not leaving. Now, every time I say that, I just about get choked up, because this is the reality of that war on the ground and what's going on there. And this is the dedication and the commitment of the men and women who are fighting on a daily basis to protect Africa's rhinos and elephants, and there's about everything else you can think of, pangolins, cycads. There are armed rangers in the Kruger Park that are protecting trees, believe it or not, that are endangered. But this fight goes on a day-to-day basis, and it's truly inspiring, and it's become the subject matter for a number of my books, including a couple that I'm working on at the moment. So
it's really funny you should say that, because I used to be the officer in charge of Cowan Station, and it was such a funny day. Like, we were doing this celebration, and all these bigwigs had flown into town. So I had the federal MPs, state MP, all the municipal MPs, really high-ranking coppers, had some high-ranking army guys there. And on that afternoon, while we were wrapping everything up, the park rangers came up and said, there's a group of blokes out in a location, and they taped up all the identifying marks on their four-wheel drive, so all everything else. We couldn't prove that there was any wildlife trafficking going on. Intel was there was, couldn't prove it, and never was. But the park ranger came and saw me in the afternoon while wrapping up this really big event, and mate, he's really excited. He goes, "Oh mate, there's a group of these guys. It's all taped up. They've got guns. It's kind of like they're all." Apparently, they got the gear and they're running around in. Mate, they had the ghillie suits. They had the whole kit.
Really?
Jeez. Yeah. And he goes, "Mate, I want to get out there right now. We want to get," because he's park ranger. He's keen as mustard. He goes, "They could be doing anything." And I'm like, "No." And he goes, "What? Like, you're scared?" I'm like, "Yeah, I am scared, but that's like, we're going to go out there, but we're not going to go out there now." He goes, "Why not? We've got to get out there." And I go, "Okay, what I'm hearing, Stu, is this. We've got a basic idea of where these guys are, but it's only about within a square kilometre. There's only one road in and out. We're going to be in a marked police vehicle coming in this thing. They're going to see us coming. We're not going to know where they are. They've got guns. These guys have been running around in ghillie suits. Okay. Tactically speaking, I'm not a commando or anything like that. But if you think we're going to go driving in there in the middle of they've got booze and they've got, God, and we know they had booze. God knows what else they got out there as well. So if you think that we're going to go driving in there in the middle of the night, the answer is no, mate. No, we are not doing that. That is not happening.
It's a really
it's
scary
risky.
situation.
Well, these guys have got guns.
Situation, exactly, yeah. And I mean, one of the things they found in the South African experience was that often the the more traditional types of force that you might think, or security agencies like the military, and even the police, tactical units like the SWAT type units and that kind of thing. You would think, oh, let's get all them in there, let's get them in there. But they weren't proving particularly effective, because what they found was the best way to catch poachers in the African bush was to be like a poacher. And that is to have these rangers. They're also incredibly brave. But yeah, they operate in very low footprint. They'll have 2 rangers will go and they will track, because they actually found that tracking was the skill. And very much to the concerns that you were talking about, the ideal, which they moved closer and closer towards over the years, was to not have a gunfight. It was to find the poachers and then to bring in other means and other resources to arrest them and capture them, not blunder about thinking, let's all go in there and let's have a gunfight,
And might see that.
Interestingly enough, in that, we talked about dogs before. Dogs have proved a huge game changer in the fight against poaching, because now what will happen is rangers may look for footprints, other sign, and they'll track a poaching gang. And when they know where they are, what they'll do now is bring in dogs. And dogs were initially employed and employed successfully on leash, like a tracker dog. But then, of course, you're still bringing the handler and the dog into close proximity with a poacher, and that can still result in violence, in a gunfight or attack. But then the use of dogs evolved. We talk about it in Rhino War, to start employing hounds. This was a concept brought in from America. American trained pack hounds, where, like in the old movies, where the hounds go searching for the escaped convicts, from the jail. They'll actually take a group of dogs, a pack of dogs in the chopper. When they're in the general vicinity or pick up a trail, when the rangers pick up a trail, they'll put down, they'll let the dogs go, and they go, and the dogs are monitored with tracking devices, and the chopper will stay above the pack of hounds, and the pack of hounds will catch the poachers. And interestingly, they're taught not to attack. They don't bite the poacher. They're not a punitive thing. They're not trying to hurt the poacher. They'll surround them, and the poor old poacher ends up 9 times out of 10 up a tree trying to get away from these dogs. And the net result of this is they proved incredibly effective. Dogs are now a factor in about 95% of all arrests, and the number of poachers injured or killed has reduced dramatically, because there isn't the need for the gun battle or the last ditch stand. The dogs pretty well take care of that kind of thing. So yeah, it's been a really interesting thing. And so the concerns that you talked about are first and foremost in people's minds these days in policing wildlife crime as well. You don't want to go in there and have a gunfight if you don't.
Oh no, and look, as important as it is preserving our wildlife, like call me a reactionary old traditionalist, I think my life is worth 10 rhinos.
And it's the thing is, you're dealing with.
I'm not getting killed for a rhino. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of armchair experts will sit back and say, oh, the poachers should be executed and hung out to dry and all this kind of things. These are civilians with rights, and they have to be arrested and treated with the same due respect to the law that anybody else would.
Absolutely.
So in countries in South Africa, there is no, as we cover in the book, there is no shoot to kill policy in South Africa. It doesn't happen. The ideal solution, a full house as it's known in anti-poaching parlance, is catch the subject, find the poacher, arrest them unharmed, get hold of the weapon, get hold of all of the evidence that's needed to convict them, and do that before they get to kill a rhino. And that is the solution that they aim for on a day-to-day basis.
Oh, and you'd be able to do that too. So, obviously if someone's walking around Kruger National Park with assault rifles and AK-47s,
they're committing an offence by being there anyway.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you can draw the indications and say, look,
exactly, yeah.
Right, well, mate, that's really, again, that passionate enthusiasm you have, and it comes through in your writing too. And it's such an interesting topic. It ticks all of the boxes. Yeah, mate, looking forward to it.
Well, I find it interesting because it's one of those things where you can get depressed. I mean, the more you learn, the worse the situation is, because we think about rhinos, or I do, and elephant. People probably aware of elephants being killed for their ivory and things, but then it goes way beyond that. I did a book a couple of years ago about cycads. There's a huge trade in illegal plants, also in Australia. It's very much
there is
Australia, and the Australians are players in that international multi-million-dollar trade in illegally harvested plants. But the last novel I did last year, The Pride, is about the trade in abalone. I got to think they call it abalone in South Africa. All my South African listeners out there, abalone, or as we say, abalone, which is also a problem in Australia in our coastal waters with people exceeding the catch limits and things like that. But we're not just talking about Joe Blow fisherman who takes a few extra shellfish. We are talking in the African context of a multi-million-dollar transnational illegal trade that's controlled by organised crime. So they have a situation in South Africa where the abalone poaching industry, because it is of industrial scale, it's estimated that the illegal market in abalone destined for Asia is 17 times the size of the legal quota that's harvested every year in South African waters. So this multi-million-dollar trade is controlled in South Africa by a particularly ruthless bunch of people known as the numbers gangs, which are organised crime gangs in South Africa, notably in the Cape Town area. And their kind of number one business commodity is drugs, what we would know as methamphetamine or ice, they call tick over there. And abalone is paid for by Chinese triads from Hong Kong in many cases and mainland China, who pay for the illegally harvested abalone shellfish in the raw materials needed to make methamphetamine or tick. So you have a wildlife, international illegal wildlife trade in abalone that's actually fueling a drug problem as well too, and really a really explosive mix of drugs, guns, and money. And that's the subject of The Pride, which is the last book that
we were getting that in Australia when I was up the Cape and in the Strait. Well, we were getting credible intel that that kind of thing was happening, and this is when all the troubles were in Papua New Guinea as well.
Yeah.
So and it makes sense. So you have all these people that were running guns up to Papua New Guinea because Papua New Guinea wanted guns.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? Well, Tony, you know well what it means. There's a transport route. There's all these things coming up. But if you're going to run stuff up, well, you might as well run stuff back.
Exactly.
So you're back on an empty truck / ship / plane / whatever it is, your form of transport. It's like, no, it doesn't make any economic sense. So you're going to bring back the cannabis and animals and plants,
and they all feed each other, right? And I think what a lot of people don't.
Well, it's business. It's just about the money.
Is that the wildlife or the natural resources element, things like the rhino horn and the elephant ivory and the abalone and pangolins and pangolin scales and things like that. The illegal trade in wildlife is up there in the big five, the top 5 crimes, along with things like human trafficking, drugs, armaments as well too, and wildlife crime is up there in amongst those as well.
And obviously your ex-military background is going to give you the ability to understand what's going on. You know how to use a gun, how people speak to each other, there's a certain camaraderie and a certain certain culture in the military and these.
It does to a certain extent. I think I have to remember that old adage that a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing as well too. So I can't afford to skimp on things like researching the caliber of bullets and firearms references and whether things have a safety catch and which side the safety catch is and things like that, because I had a certain amount of experience in the military and I was never in action, but I there's that lovely line, I think, from Stephen E. Ambrose, were you a hero? No, but I served in the company of heroes. Absolutely. And so I have been exposed to a lot of really interesting stuff over the years in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And yes, you as a writer, you draw, I think, on all your experiences as a person, and part of my experience has been in uniform. And I think, as you say, it does help you talk to people to get info. I've done that with the new book that comes out this year. It does touch on some veterans issues and some military issues. So I think it helps as perhaps a way to open doors. But I don't think it's a shortcut. I have to remember to still do my research and just check all those little details and things like that as well.
Can we talk about the book coming out?
Sure. No, I'll give you a scoop. Okay. So I've had a few people, I've been posting on on social media since I've been back in Australia the last few weeks. I'm heading back to Africa next week, which is, as we record this, is later in March. But I've been working on the beach, and when I sort of put screenshots on of what I'm working on, a few of my readers is, oh, what are you working on? What's this one about?
Yeah.
So I'll give you the scoop. So my 21st novel comes out worldwide in August of this year, 2022, and it's going to be called Vendetta. And it touches on yet another wildlife crime that I've learned about in recent years. I've spent some time on the coast in South Africa, and I've learned about shark finning, so the practice of sharks being killed quite brutally and quite horribly for their fin, which is marketed as a delicacy in soups in part of the world. But the thing with shark finning is it's been it's illegal. It's been made illegal now in South Africa, but it's still a big problem along the coast of Africa, coastline of the continent of Africa, because what happens is I like fish. You know, I'm not against fishing. I like seafood. You know, I dare say I've eaten my fair share of shark at fish and chip shops over the years as well too. But the finning is horrendous, because what happens is the fin of a shark is worth far more than the flesh of a shark. And so what happens in parts of the world, and had been happening, was that when unscrupulous fishermen catch a shark, they will cut the fin off while the shark is still alive, and they will toss the dying shark overboard, because it's not worth them taking that whole shark, because they can fit many fins on a boat, many more fins than they can whole sharks. So the law says now, if you want to sell a fin, which you can, you have to bring the whole shark in with you into shore and make the most, harvest that animal ethically. So I've touched on this practice of shark finning. So Vendetta starts on the coast, but then moves, funnily enough, to the desert area of southern Africa, into the Kalahari Desert, near an area known as the Kgalagadi Transfrontier Park. And it's a bit of a murder mystery. It's about a guide who has passed away, taken his own life. And he is a tracker. He's a sand man, which is the modern
Kalahari Bushman.
Yeah, exactly. The modern term for what we knew perhaps in our younger years as the Bushman, which is a term that's not used these days out of respect. So he's a sand tracker. No, it's still in common use. No, it is. And everyone would be aware of the gods must be crazy and the Bushmen of the Kalahari. And it's just that they prefer to be known as the sand. And the sand trackers have a fascinating history, because they were actually employed, getting back to our previous conversation, by the South African Defence Force during their apartheid era wars as trackers. Indeed, even General Euster, who's the subject of Rhino War, one of his jobs in the army was as the commanding officer of what was known as the Bushman Battalion, the 31 Battalion at the time. The Sand people had a history, in some cases, of conflict with some of the other African cultures that were fighting the apartheid regime and the Portuguese colonialists, and they found themselves in a position of politics making strange bedfellows, fighting on the side of the South African Defence Force, where they were employed very effectively for their tracking skills. And many of these sand people who had come from Angola originally found themselves relocated into South Africa after that war and after independence in 1994, 1995. Interestingly enough, Nelson Mandela granted immunity and land to these particular people, even though they had fought against his people on the other side. So Vendetta is a book that goes backwards and forwards in time. Part of the action takes place in the present day, where Louise, our sand tracker, has been found dead. Yet a group of men comes together for his funeral service, who had all served with him during the Bush War in Angola, during the border war in 1987, and they share a very dark and very deeply held secret from that time. And as the investigation into Louise's death and into the investigation into another veteran who has taken his own life progresses, we learn more and more about what was happening to these men back in 1987. So it touches on politics, it touches on the border war in Angola, it touches on the plight of the San, whose story in itself is a fascinating modern day a story of First Nations people and their plight. So there's a lot in it. It's called Vendetta, and it comes out in August. And you heard it here first, Matt. There you go.
Well, that's pretty cool and exciting. Thank you so much for that. Seriously,
Pleasure.
And mate, look, it kind of resonates with me too, because we did we were getting, when I was in the Straits, we were getting quite a lot of fishermen coming from Indonesia, coming down, and they weren't coming so much down for the shark. The sharks was just fishing generally. It was coral trout they were kind of aiming at. But yeah, we did a couple of more than one or two boarding parties on the little boats there.
And there's a lot of interesting parallels, isn't there? Because I used to work quite a bit with when I was in the army. When I was an air dispatcher, we used to do aerial resupply to Norforce, which is that,
Yes,
little, perhaps not in your area, but in the rest of Australia, I don't think enough people know about what a unique and effective unit that is.
The 51st, go Sarpai.
51st Far North
boys.
Queensland,
Yeah.
exactly. And the Northwest Mobile Force, or Norforce, up in the Northern Territory. And the great job that our Indigenous soldiers do using their particular local knowledge and tracking knowledge to do a real-time job. Exactly like you're talking about policing our coastline for illegal fishing and illegal incursions and drugs and all that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels. And I think I would hope that people in your part of Australia that are aware of those sort of issues and would be perhaps with a military background or a law enforcement background. I think there's probably a bit of that in this book for those people as well too.
Oh, they're going to love it. And considering all the I do disproportionately coppers and military, although strangely disproportionately I actually have more female listeners than male, which is
most of my readers are women. I think there's a risk in packaging is that some people can think that books like this, or people like Wilbur Smith books and in Africa, people think, oh, these are books for dad or grandpa or something like that. But most of my readers, and I dare say most of the late Wilbur Smith readers, are probably females and women as well too. I think I think reading's an interesting thing, and books are an interesting thing. I never want to be pigeonholed. I'm a big fan of the author Ken Follett, and one of the things I like about Ken Follett's books is he would quite often. He wouldn't have a leading man, he'd have a leading lady. And so his protagonist would be a female character. And so in The Pride, I have a recurring female character by the name of Sonia Kurtz, who's a former military person herself. And she comes back in the Pride. So I think it's too narrow and too old fashioned to say that this is a book or a podcast for men or like that. We're way beyond that in Australia. And I think certainly in the Australian literary industry, we have so many fantastic women writers in all genres, and again, I think sometimes they fight not to be pigeonholed themselves as well too. So just as I think, well, I'm not writing books just for boys, my good friend Fleur McDonald writes detective stories set in the rural Australia, and they're very much for men and women.
And see, that's it, mate. You've nailed it spot on there too. And but I having made all those qualifications, there is a touch of Wilbur Smith about your. Okay, I'm just throwing it out there.
only two. Rest in peace, old Wilbur. The only two differences between me is about him and me is 35 books and about $35 million.
Oh,
but having said that, I seriously, I quite liked his earlier novels set in the 70s and 80s. Let us be 100% frank about this. He was writing them by himself in his later life. And even today, he's passed away. He's not writing those books. But when he was writing books by himself in the 70s and 80s, they tended to be contemporary issues set in Southern Africa. And if there is a similarity between me and the great late Wilbur Smith, it's that we, at that period in his life, he was writing the sort of books that I write today. Very much about contemporary issues and politics and poaching and wildlife issues, and
absolutely, and the military thing too.
And the military,
like a lot of his heroes were.
Absolutely, and he delved into a bit of military historical fiction in an African context. I've done that in a couple of books. Ghosts of the Past was set in the 1900s in Southwest Africa, now Namibia. I did a book called African Sky, the premise of which is based on a true story that a large number of Australian airmen, Royal Australian Air Force personnel, actually undertook their training in Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe.
And so that has a background in truth, as does Ghosts of the Past. And Wilbur has done that as well in some of his books in the past, dipped into the First and the Second World War in that African context. So yeah, and that's kind of what I've done in Vendetta as well, as touched on the border war. I hope I've done it justice. I've tried to be as sensitive to it as I can, because very many of my friends in South Africa of my age served in the South African Defence Forces, served in that conflict. So I have felt under quite a bit of pressure to get it right. I've actually had 4 veterans already read the manuscript and have their input into the book as well. So hopefully we'll make it as accurate as we.
Yeah, because you don't want it simplistic. I actually, God, it was years ago. I was a teenager. I knew a guy who was in the Sleuth Scouts, and man, like, no disrespect to any other elite services, but yeah, the Sleuth Scouts, man, those guys were the best of the best of the best of the best kind of stuff. They were just.
It's incredible. I mean,
amazing.
I think if you look at that Southern African history from a military point of view, those conflicts in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and in the border went on for many, many, many years, and to a large extent they were fought by, ordinary soldiers, sometimes on call up, doing their what we would think of as reserve duty, but going back into action time and time again, and on the other side of the liberation forces, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in Southern Africa today, and I've touched on it in Vendetta, where there are regularly tours by South African Defence Force veterans into Angola, where they go to not only revisit old battlefields from the 80s, but they actually go to help out their former enemies. They go and have programs to look after disabled veterans. In what is a very poor country, a country that has large natural resources, that sometimes doesn't filter down to ordinary people. And they will work on aid programs in villages. They will look after their former enemies who are disabled or doing it tough these days. And sometimes those parties are escorted by also South Africans who fought in the liberation movements in the African National Congress and SWAPO. And they've come together in a very mature and healing sort of way to get past their issues that they have all shared in many respects. So there's a lot of interesting stuff coming out of there. I've touched on that briefly in the book as well.
Yeah, and you do. It's very touching when you sort of see that. And I've seen documentaries with Australians going back to Vietnam, and World War II. Saw an excellent documentary about a whole bunch of Australians that were actually invited to an Africa Corps reunion.
Yep.
This was like in the 60s, and they ended up
incredible. Yeah.
So they ended up in this beer house, like the Lederhausen guys drinking beers with these guys.
I've got to tell you, it's a bit of a stretch of the imagination for me to imagine going back to Afghanistan for a holiday, but who knows? Yeah,
well, but one of the earliest ones I saw was they got the Americans filmed this just before the First World War, I think. I think the last Civil War veterans died in the 1930s. I think I may be just, but they got some guys from Gettysburg, together, and these and they were pretty old men by this stage. Obviously, these guys would have been born in the 1840s, and we didn't live that long back then either, as you well. Sure. You get to 80 or 90, it's like, whoa, bro. This really touching reunion of these guys that some of the guys, and they saw each other they had these two guys talking in this, and because Pickett's Charge, I don't know how familiar you are with American Civil War history, but Pickett's Charge was one of the most, it's this really important part of the battle. And there are all these rock rows, and these guys, I remember you on these guys remember, they remember seeing each other, at Charge. It's just absolutely amazing stuff. And they ended up, this kind of the wounds never really, really, really healed internally, but to see these guys, friends again.
Yeah, it's just humanity, isn't it?
It's so moving.
There's so much more that unites us than divides us, really.
Well, that leads on to my next question for you, mate. So, you're living a pretty incredible life, really. And it's not just the life that you're living, but you're getting a lot of vicarious experience from the people that you're speaking to. And it's like firsthand. And obviously, that does, really help you get the perspective. I'm going to go even further here too. Like when you invent a character and you live their experience, that gives you even more experience. You know what I mean? So it's an exaggeration to say there's probably hundreds of lives of experience that you've got together. What is all this teaching you, mate? Like, how's it changed you? How's it changed your worldview? Like what?
Well, I think it has in many ways, because in the nonfiction as well, like it does translate into the fiction, but in the nonfiction, you deal with some pretty confronting stuff. People have been through trauma. I mean, the circumstances in which both Keith Payne and Daniel Kieran found themselves in, which resulted in them receiving the Victoria Cross, were horrendous, And when that person is reliving that when you're interviewing them for a book, and I'm taking it on board when I'm writing, and you have to be careful with that, because you can find yourself suffering from a thing called vicarious trauma, where you're actually sharing the trauma that people have been through, and you have to keep an eye on it as well too, and keep it in perspective, because it does move you. And I think one of the things, the serious part of this job, whether you're writing fiction or non-fiction, is that you're dealing with very raw emotions. Now, to one extent, most of us unfortunately have had experience of grief or loss. But to write that continually, to put it in there, you have to keep an eye on doing it sensitively and not gratuitously. But I think you have to keep an eye on your own mental health when you're doing it. You have to keep it in perspective. I think what I find when I write this kind of stuff is adversity and tragedy, whether it's in warfare or on the field of battle, or in the protection of endangered species, or crime fighting, if you've got a law enforcement background like yourself, is that you're exposed to the worst of humankind, but you're also exposed to the best.
To the best.
We must remember that. We must record that, celebrate it. It's easy in a country like South Africa today, where they continue to lose rhinos, to become very demoralized and very downhearted and say, this is hopeless. We're never going to win this fight. All these animals are going to die out. But you just don't have to look very far to find incredible examples of heroism, of inspiration, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things on a day-to-day basis for good, And something I like to say is, if there's one thing that struck me in the last 27 odd years of living and traveling in Africa that's greater than the scope of problems that we face, and there are plenty of them, poverty and corruption and crime and these terrible wildlife crimes and poaching and health issues, it is that thing called the indomitable human spirit, the ability of good men and women, more often than not at the coalface, not in the ivory towers, but on the ground, on the veldt, in the bush, literally putting their lives on the line to help each other, to help animals, or volunteering to alleviate poverty or to educate little kids. There's too much good out there to ignore it, And I am, if anyone hasn't read my books, and as you may know, I am a bit of a sucker for a happy ending. And that's what I like to celebrate, because when you write a book, you need inspiration, and inspiration is at one level is just stuff. It's just ideas for a book. I've got no shortage of ideas. Unfortunately, I've got no shortage of ideas to write books for the rest of my life, with all this lot of terrible stuff that happens. But inspiration also means, to be inspired, to be uplifted, and I see no shortage of that. And I think we need to celebrate the good guys and the good girls.
And that's so true. Like there really is, like in that darkness, there are these, sometimes you just get these amazing shines of light. Like it's just absolutely amazing when you see that. And having been privileged to, see that kind of stuff myself firsthand, actually seeing some amazing, people do absolutely amazing things.
You would have seen it. Ordinary people. Yeah.
And not just the coppers too, incidentally, like, a lot of times you go into some crime scene and you're clearing it all up afterwards, and you find out that some untrained civilian who's never been exposed to anything like this has just done something, incredible, or just kept their nerve and not on all wobbly. Like that's just amazing things.
Incredible heroism. Yeah, exactly.
Really
and strength.
It's
and that's
humbling.
Inspiring. Yeah, it's humbling and inspiring, I think, at the same time. Yeah.